collect questions. Today we're here at the Dead Writers Society looking for someone to interview. Oh, here's Jane Austen. Jane, come over here.
Hello.
Hi, do you mind if we ask you some questions?
Of course, of course.
Alright, so we all know Jane Austen writes books, but could you tell us a little more about yourself?
Well, I was born December 16th, 1775 in Steventon, Hampshire, England. I was the seventh child to Cassandra and George Austen. I died 42 years later on July 18th, 1817 from tuberculosis. Throughout my life, I lived in many different cities in England, such as Oxford, Winchester, and Chawton.
So what was your family like growing up?
Well, growing up, my parents were well-respected community members, my father even serving as the Oxford-educated rector for a nearby Anglican parish, and my mother actually had higher social status than my father. My family was very close growing up, especially because as children grew up in a household that valued learning and creative thinking. I also played the forte piano. Through the years, I grew closest to my father and my older sister, Cassandra. We were encouraged to read in the family's extensive library. Soon, we were both sent to boarding school. During this time, though, both Cassandra and I caught typhus, nearly dying from the disease. This was cut short by financial constraints, so we returned home and lived with the family.
For those watchers that might not know some of your literary works, can you tell us some of your famous titles and give us a glimpse into what makes your book so special?
Well, my first published novel was called Sense and Sensibility, which I wrote in 1811. Before this, I had other works done, such as short stories. However, this was my first novel. In the next years, I wrote Pride and Prejudice, one of my most famous works, as well as Mansfield Park and Emma. The year I died, I wrote Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, but they did not become famous until after my death. The theme of my works has revolved around romance and love, being centered around a pair of characters. Something funny about my writing, I wrote about the love between a man and woman. However, I was never married. I once received a marriage proposal from Harris Big Wither when I was visiting my sister. Originally, I agreed to this proposal, but once I slept on the thought, I withdrew my acceptance.
Was Harris Big Wither the one love that inspired all your works of art?
Actually, no. Many of my works are inspired by an Irish law student who was the nephew of my next-door neighbor. His name was Tom Lefroy. We spent lots of time together when he visited Steventon for a month. Right after he left Steventon, he became engaged to someone else. Although he broke my heart, he still inspired all my pieces, and I will always admire him.
Why did some of your works not become famous until after you died?
Yes, sadly, I did not get to experience the luxuries of being a famous author. However, I am so amazed to see that my books are considered a classic today. Times were very different when I wrote my book. No one would read a book in public, especially by a woman. My books were satirical, therefore people did not feel often comfortable reading them.
Why did a lot of your works not become famous until after you died?
Yes, sadly, I did not get to experience the luxuries of being a famous author. However, I am so amazed to see that my books are considered a classic today. Times were very different when I wrote my book. No one would read a book in public, especially by a woman. My books were satirical, therefore people did not feel often comfortable reading them. However, as time began to progress, people changed, and so did the popularity of my books. As it became more acceptable to read famous authors, it became acceptable to read my novel. My book became a moral guide and lessons to other women.
What was life like during the time that you were living?
In my early life, my family and I were very close. However, as I grew up, I began to realize many bigger issues were taking place around me. The Regency era was known as the period where King George III was deemed unfit to rule. The Prince of Wales was a heavy drinker and gambler, often throwing away his money. The king was also known for having violent fits. For these reasons, he was taken off the throne. During this time, the middle class and upper class was growing. However, I was never that knowledgeable about the lower class, being that I grew up in a rather nice household. Like other times, family was one of the most important aspects of the culture. The father was the head of the family, and being that he was the one to work in my family, my father was the head of the household too. Art was also observed. Many potters and playwrights were celebrated for their work.
Since Pride and Prejudice may be one of your most celebrated novels, do you have anything interesting to share with your readers about that specific novel?
Well, I wrote Pride and Prejudice when I was 21. However, it was not published until I was 37. A lot of people don't know that I originally named the book First Impressions. Once I read the novel Cecilia by Fanny Fancy Burney. I took one of the passages and created the title to my book from it.
Your novels are often referred to as a guide for young women at the time. Why do you think this is?
I think women can connect to the difficulty and pressures one faces when navigating tough social situations. Many of the women who read my books can relate to the main characters as they come of age and are faced with problems of the heart. I think my books also provide women with a strong female character whom they can look up to and use as an example of how they should act in these situations.
What was the country like during the time that you grew up?
It was a male-dominated society for sure, and women were very dependent on their husbands and fathers. At the time I was living, the Revolutionary War was taking place in the States. Parliament had declared that Massachusetts was in a rebellion. King George issued a proclamation of rebellion against the colonies. Other famous authors included Johann Rudolph Weiss, Charles Maturin, and Horace Smith. They were very influential writers at the time.
Contrast this. Did this culture carry out into when you began to write?
Well, as I began to write, times were changing. King George III was seen as too weak for the throne, and his son, the Prince of Wales, then came to power. The Prince of Wales was known as Prince Regent, making the period time the Regency era. King George III greatly opposed to the freedom of the American colonies, and this greatly decreased his popularity in England. During the Regency period, Parliament met at least once a year to discuss a military budget and various bills. Although the prince seemed to be much better than King George III, he was a heavy drinker and gambler and threw away his money. With regards to the culture, women were not allowed to hold jobs and were completely dependent on men for money. If they wished to improve their social status, then they had to marry well. Women spent their time gossiping and talking fashion, and they had to have a chaperone with them at all times. Historical events were interesting as well at the time. The war with France was still continuing. There was this trace of turmoil abroad that was seen throughout England. My brother was fighting in the war, so I had direct contact to the military. Other famous authors at the time included Anne Radcliffe, Fanny Burney, Elizabeth Inchbald, Maria Edgeworth, Maria Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley. Madame Anne Louisa Germaine de Stael was a famous literary critic at the time who reviewed my work very closely.
The time period you became famous was the early 19th century. What was life like during this time?
During the time I became famous, World War I was occurring from turmoil within Europe. World War I caused shortages in supplies for British people, and the war cost Britain a great deal of money. During this time period, women were starting to gain more dependence and not have to rely on men. Women started going out with their friends, and chaperones were no longer required. World War I greatly shaped the world and changed the atmosphere of Europe for years. At the time, other influential authors were Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle, and L. Frank Baum.
All right, well, thank you for your time and answering our questions.
All right, thank you.